Way back when I started to learn histology, I have to admit it was not one of my favorite subjects. I found it difficult to learn and it wasn't that interesting to me. However, as I learned more about the different types of tissue in the body and their specific functions and the details of the cells that we will discuss, the more interested I became in it, and now it fascinates me. Histology is a wonderful topic, and you could spend a semester at least on each of these categories. There are 4 types of tissue, which you need to know forever, not just for the purposes of this class. It's going to be connective tissue, and conveniently, connective tissue does just that. It's going to connect different parts of the body. Epithelial tissue will line cavities and cover surfaces. Muscle tissue, of course, is needed for movement, whether it be skeletal muscle tissue so we can move our body, or smooth muscle tissue so we can move materials throughout the body, or cardiac muscle tissue to keep us going because the heart needs to keep pumping. And then last but certainly not least, nervous tissue. Please note that the correct name for nervous tissue is nervous tissue. Do not call it nerve tissue. When you talk about nerve tissue, you are talking about a section of a named structure like the brachial nerve or the femoral nerve. We do not have nerves in the central nervous system, and therefore, the correct name for all nervous tissue is nervous tissue, not nerve tissue. You will get it wrong if you mark that on a test. For me. You do need to understand the fluid distribution within the body. Cells are going to be surrounded by a watery medium, and that is known as extracellular fluid. It is also known as interstitial fluid. And we also have plasma, and plasma is that atypical liquid matrix of blood. Blood is considered a connective tissue. The fluid that you find within cells is known as the intracellular fluid, also known as the cytosol. And that shows you the distribution of fluid, how much is intracellular, how much is extracellular, and how much is plasma. We have already talked about the cell junctions, the tight junctions, and the desmosomes and the gap junctions. The tight junctions are going to, does anybody remember? Provide an impermeable barrier in between cells. Gap junctions will provide a way for cells to communicate with each other, and desmosomes kind of act like spot wells to help keep cells together. We're going to jump into the epithelial tissue information, and you do need to know these characteristics. When you're looking at slides of epithelial tissue, you will see that the cells are really tightly packed together. There's very little material in between the cells. In addition, epithelial tissue will always have an apical surface, which means that there is going to be one surface that will open to the outside or to an internal space, and the internal space of a vessel is known as a lumen. So the area that blood travels through blood vessels is known as a lumen, and the space that you find within kidney tubules is a lumen, and the internal space through which food moves through your digestive tract is also known as a lumen. Now, that apical surface may allow the cells to have modifications or specializations, which include microvilli. And you remember microvilli are found on epithelial tissue and only epithelial tissue, and they are going to increase surface area for increased nutrient absorption. And cilia, and you'll remember that cilia is going to move material across the surface of a tissue. If you see microvilli or you hear about microvilli in literature, or if you see cilia on a micrograph, you are always talking about epithelial tissue. Another characteristic that is unique to epithelial tissue is the basement membrane. So you'll remember that the epithelial tissue will have an apical surface that is exposed to some sort of opening or outside. On the basal surface will be the basement membrane. And again, epithelial tissue is the only type of tissues that have basement membranes. The basement membrane is actually connective tissue. There are going to be two layers, a basal lamina and a reticular lamina. Those two layers, for the purpose of this course, are nice to know, not a need to know. That shows you a lovely basement membrane. So you can see the basement membrane here. And you can also see the apical surface. So this is going to be the inside of the trachea. And these little furry things right here are, can anyone guess? Cilia. Remember, you need an electron microscope in order to be able to see microvilli. In addition, epithelial tissue is avascular. Epithelial tissue contains no blood vessels, and that means that everything that gets into those cells has to move through the cell by diffusion. There is no direct blood supply. Because of that, you're going to notice two facts. These cells have to regenerate really quickly, because if you are not getting nutrients except via diffusion, your chance of living for a long time is pretty limited, especially if you're talking about multiple layers. And in addition to that, you're going to find these guys in areas of really high wear and tear. So think about your digestive tract. Epithelial tissue is going to line the lumen of the digestive tract. So sure enough, that's an area of high wear and tear. For example, as we said, these tissues will cover all body surfaces, both inside and out. I want you to remember this, because some of you will be lucky enough to get a question on your lab practical, which asks about providing characteristics of epithelial tissue. Do not tell me where they are located. Location is not a characteristic. Characteristics are things like they contain a basement membrane, or they're attached to the underlying tissue through a basement membrane. They are avascular. They have a high mitosis rate. They have an apical surface. All of those are characteristics. Location is not. These are functions. We know that they will cover all body surfaces, so of course that associates with the protective function. And in fact, if you look at your skin, that's the epidermis, that is multiple layers of simple squamous epithelium, and the skin acts like a barrier to keep pathogens out. So it acts like the first line of defense of the immune system. Absorption, sure enough, you're going to need to absorb material through the digestive system, for example. Secretion, yep, you're going to be secreting material out of kidney tubules, and the kidney tubules are formed by simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Excretion, yes, for example, your sweat glands are going to be made up of, in part, epithelial tissue, and you will be excreting sweat through them. Filtration is going to be important because when you talk about the kidneys, there's going to be a process which is the very first step in urine formation, which is known as glomerular filtration, and sensation. But epithelial tissues, they don't have receptors, and they're not connected to the central nervous system. No, they're not, but in all epithelial tissues, you will have receptors that are associated with the nervous system, so you will get sensation through those tissues. How do we classify epithelial tissue? Remember this, number of layers and by the shape of cells. The number of layers of cells and by the shape of the cells. Do not tell me layers and shape, because that doesn't tell me enough information. It is by the number of layers of cells and by the shape of the cells. And we're going to jump into each and every one of these in the next section.